They said I was too old for love. My own blood, my children, the ones I had rocked in my arms and sung to sleep, they were the ones who delivered this particular verdict. Too old. As if love came with an expiration date, like a carton of milk you'd forgotten in the back of the fridge. Their words, meant perhaps as some sort of twisted kindness, a shield against future disappointment, landed like stones, each one a separate bruise on a heart that had already known its share of weather. I'd look in the mirror, you see, and I'd see the lines etched by time, by laughter, by tears, by worry. A road map of a life lived, yes, but in their eyes, it was just a map to a closed territory. No new visitors welcome, especially not love. The silence in my house had grown so vast over the years. It had a voice of its own. It whispered in the corners, echoed in the empty chairs at the dinner table. My late husband, John. He'd been gone a decade, and the space he left, well, it never really filled. You just learn to walk around it, a tender spot you avoid bumping into. But loneliness, it's a persistent vine, isn't it? It creeps, it winds, it tightens, until sometimes you feel you can barely breathe. They saw me pottering in my garden, reading my books, attending my little community meetings, and they thought, she's content, she's settled, she's done. Such a final word for a life still being lived. And what did they expect? That I should just fade quietly into the wallpaper, a relic of a bygone era. Their pronouncements, usually delivered at those strained family dinners, became a chorus. Mum, you're 72. Focus on the grandkids, that's your joy now. Don't go getting any silly ideas. Silly ideas. As if the yearning for connection, for a hand to hold, for a shared glance that says, I understand, was a flight of fancy reserved for the young and unlined. The irony was, they were the ones who seemed old, their thinking ossified, their compassion rationed. I remember one afternoon, the sun was slanting low, painting the kitchen gold, and my daughter, Sarah, she actually patted my hand and said, It's for the best, Mum. Less complicated this way. Less complicated for whom, I wondered. For them, certainly. They wouldn't have to adjust their neat narratives about their aging mother. The fall, when it happened, was mundane. A loose rug, a moment of distraction. One minute I was reaching for a teacup, the next the world tilted, and the floor rushed up with a brutal finality. Pain, sharp and searing, shot through my hip, and a cold dread washed over me. Lying there, helpless, the words too old echoed with a new, more sinister resonance. Too old to be clumsy, too old to recover, too old to be anything but a burden. It was in that moment, staring up at the familiar pattern of the ceiling, that I felt the full weight of their expectations, and a small, defiant spark ignited within me. Was this it? Was this how my story was supposed to dwindle? The wait for help felt like an eternity. Each tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, a hammer blow against my dwindling composure. Then the sound of the siren, faint at first, then growing, a promise of intervention. 2 paramedics arrived, their presence filling the sudden quiet of my small living room. One was young, efficient, all brisk movements and quick questions. The other, he was older, perhaps in his late 50s, with eyes that seemed to hold a gentle understanding, a kindness that wasn't just professional. His name was Arthur. He knelt beside me, his voice calm, reassuring. All right there, dear. Let's have a look. Don't you worry. We'll take good care of you. There was no pity in his gaze, no hint of the impatience I sometimes saw in my own children when my pace didn't match theirs. Just a quiet competence, a focused concern that was profoundly comforting. He explained everything he was doing, his touch surprisingly gentle as he assessed my injury. The pain was still intense, a throbbing beast, but his presence somehow lessened its bite. I remember the way he spoke, not down to me, not as if I were a fragile piece of china, but as an equal, someone deserving of respect and clear information. It was such a stark contrast to the subtle condescension that had become the background music of my life. My family, they loved me. I know they did, in their own way. But their love had become entangled with a narrative of my decline, of my supposed limitations. They saw the years, the wrinkles, the slowing step, and they drew their conclusions. Arthur, in that moment of crisis, saw a person in need, a human being. Nothing more, nothing less. As they prepared to move me, he caught my eye. "You're stronger than you think," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. It wasn't a platitude. It felt like an observation, a truth he perceived. Those words, they were a lifeline. In the ambulance, with the siren wailing a path through the city, I found myself watching him, the way his hands moved, the quiet attention he gave to his tasks, the occasional thoughtful glance he sent my way. There was a steadiness about him, a rootedness that I, feeling so upended, found myself clinging to. It wasn't romantic. Not then. How could it be? I was in agony, disheveled, frightened, but it was human. A connection forged in vulnerability, a moment of grace in the midst of chaos. He was just doing his job, I told myself. But there was something more, a quality of care that transcended mere duty. It was the first flicker of warmth I'd felt from a stranger in a very long time. A warmth that had nothing to do with the heated blanket they'd tucked around me, and it felt, unexpectedly, like a beginning. My recovery was slow, a tedious journey measured in small victories. The first unaided step, the first night slept without waking from the ache in my hip. The hospital had been efficient, impersonal. It was back in the quiet of my own home that the real work began, the work of mending not just bone, but spirit. My children visited, of course. They brought flowers that wilted too quickly, and fruit I barely touched. Their concern was genuine, I suppose, but it was always tinged with that familiar refrain, "You see, Mum? You need to be more careful. At your age. At my age." That phrase again, a constant reminder of their perception of my fragility. One afternoon, about a week after I'd returned home, the doorbell rang. It was Arthur. He was off duty, dressed in civilian clothes, a small pot of bright yellow chrysanthemums in his hand. "Thought these might cheer the place up," he said, a little awkwardly. "Just wanted to see how you were faring. We don't often get to follow up, you know." I was surprised, touched. We sat in the kitchen, the sunlight making patterns on the linoleum floor, and we talked. Not about my hip, not about my age, but about books, about gardening. He confessed to having a rather unruly vegetable patch, about the changing seasons. It was easy, comfortable. He didn't fill the silences with chatter, but let them breathe, much like John used to. He listened, truly listened. When I spoke of my roses, of the robins that nested in the old apple tree, he saw the woman behind the elderly patient label. He saw Margaret. My daughter, Sarah, called while he was there. Her voice, when I told her who my visitor was, sharpened with suspicion. "A paramedic? Why is he there, Mum? Is everything all right?" I explained, but I could hear the unspoken questions, the judgment forming. After he left, the chrysanthemums a cheerful splash of color on the windowsill, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in years. Our conversations became a quiet ritual. Sometimes he'd call just to check in. Sometimes, if he was passing by after a shift, he'd stop for a cup of tea. My family, when I mentioned him, were dismissive. "He's just being kind, Mum. It's his job to be nice to old ladies." Old ladies. There it was, again. My son, Tom, even chuckled. "Next, you'll be telling us he's your new beau." The words were meant to sting, to put me in my place, and they did. But beneath the sting, something else was stirring. A stubborn refusal to let their narrow definitions confine me. Arthur's friendship was a small, precious seed, and I found myself tending it carefully, protecting it from the frost of their cynicism. It wasn't about rebellion, not consciously. It was about connection, a simple human need they seemed to have forgotten I possessed. The quiet friendship with Arthur began to bloom, unfurling like one of my late-season roses, unexpected but all the more precious for its unlikeliness. It wasn't a whirlwind, nothing dramatic. It was built on small moments, shared silences, and the growing recognition of a kindred spirit. He'd bring me books he thought I'd enjoy from the little free library near his station, and I'd save him the crispiest cookies from my baking days. We discovered a shared love for old films, the black and white kind, where dialogue mattered more than explosions. Sometimes we'd just sit in my garden, me on my usual bench, him in the rickety chair I kept for visitors, and watch the bees busy themselves among the lavender. He never pushed, never presumed. He simply was present, attentive. His laughter, when it came, was genuine, a warm, rumbling sound that seemed to chase the shadows from the corners of my days. I found myself laughing more too, a lighter, easier laugh than I'd known in years. I started to feel a shift within me, a thawing. The parts of me that had felt frozen, dormant, began to stir. It was as if a window, long shuttered, had been nudged open, letting in fresh air and sunlight. I was still Margaret, the mother, the grandmother, the widow, but I was also becoming Margaret, the woman, with her own quiet joys, her own budding hopes. My children, however, saw these changes through their own distorted lens. "You seem different, Mum," Sarah would say, her brow furrowed, as if different was a symptom of some new ailment. "You're always talking about that Arthur fellow." There was an edge to her voice, a disapproval that was becoming harder to ignore. Tom was more blunt. "Honestly, Mother, what's going on? He's a paramedic, for heaven's sake. He probably feels sorry for you." "Feels sorry for me." Their words were like little paper cuts, small but stinging, accumulating. Did they truly believe that was all I was capable of inspiring? Pity? It was a bitter pill to swallow, this casual cruelty from those I loved most. They couldn't see the gentle respect in Arthur's eyes, the genuine pleasure he took in our conversations. They couldn't see him. Not really. They only saw their narrative. Lonely old woman, kind younger man, though he wasn't that much younger. A recipe for delusion on my part, perhaps exploitation on his. The thought, their unspoken suspicion, was insulting. But the more they pushed, the more I found a quiet strength welling up inside me. Arthur saw me. He saw the person I was, not the age I happened to be. He saw my mind, still sharp, my humor, still intact, my capacity for affection, still very much alive. And in his seeing me, I began to see myself differently too. Not as someone whose best days were behind her, but as someone whose story was still unfolding. The more I spoke of Arthur, the more the gentle blossoming of our connection seemed to ignite a strange sort of panic in my children. Their dismissiveness curdled into active ridicule. Their concern, if it ever truly was that, sharpened into something that felt like accusation. "Mum, you have to be realistic," Sarah said one Sunday, her voice tight with a kind of exasperated pity I'd come to dread. We were in my kitchen, the scent of roast chicken, a meal I'd made hoping for a peaceful family gathering, hanging heavy and unsavored in the air. A man like that, he's got his own life. He's probably just being nice because, well, you're a sweet old lady. There it was again, that label, old lady, delivered with the casual force of a dismissal. Sweet, perhaps, but implicitly foolish, deluded. Tom, ever the pragmatist, or so he fancied himself, chimed in. She's right, Mum. Don't go reading things into it. You'll only end up getting hurt. And frankly, it's a bit unseemly. Unseemly. The word hung there, ugly and judgmental. Unseemly for whom? For me? To dare to feel a spark of life, a connection, beyond the boundaries they had drawn for me, or unseemly for them to have to adjust their comfortable image of their mother as a benign, sexless, dateless matriarch content with her knitting and her memories. What could he possibly see in you? My granddaughter, Emily, Sarah's eldest, usually a quiet girl, blurted it out during one particularly strained phone call, then immediately clapped her hand over her mouth, her voice small, with apology. But the words were out, echoing the sentiment her mother and uncle had been subtly, and not so subtly, conveying for weeks. What could he see in me? The question was a cold blade. It wasn't just about Arthur anymore, was it? It was about my worth, my desirability. Not in a romantic sense necessarily, but as a human being worthy of genuine, non-pitying affection from someone outside the family. Their words were intended to douse any nascent hope, to shepherd me back into the pen of their expectations. They painted Arthur as either a saint taking pity, or worse, someone with less than honorable intentions, though they never quite dared to voice that aloud. The pain of their skepticism was profound. These were the people I had raised, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose fears I had soothed. And now, they looked at me, and instead of seeing a woman capable of attracting kindness and companionship, they saw only age, vulnerability, and the potential for embarrassment, for themselves. Yet, something in their opposition began to clarify things for me. Their ridicule, their disbelief, it became a dark backdrop against which the quiet authenticity of Arthur's regard shone all the brighter. A stubborn resilience took root. I was not a fool. I was not deluded. I knew kindness when I felt it. I knew respect when I saw it. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised even myself, that what was growing between Arthur and me was real and precious. And I would not let them trample it. The turning point, the moment when quiet friendship dared to dream of something more, arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. Arthur had called, suggesting a walk by the river if I felt up to it. The autumn air was crisp. Leaves of amber and crimson drifted from the trees, and the water flowed with a steady, calming rhythm. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, then sat on a bench, overlooking a weeping willow that trailed its branches in the current. He turned to me, his gaze direct, yet gentle. "Margaret," he began, his voice a little huskier than usual. "These past few months, spending time with you, it's been the best part of my days." My heart gave a little flutter. A sensation, I thought, long lost to me. He continued, "I know this might seem unexpected, and I know there's a difference in our years, though perhaps not as much as some might imagine." He paused, taking my hand, his touch warm and firm. "I find myself thinking about a future that includes you, Margaret. Not just as a friend, though you are a cherished one, but as something more, as my partner. As my wife, if you'd even consider it." The world seemed to hold its breath. Wife. The word resonated deep within me, stirring a mix of disbelief, joy, and a sudden, sharp fear. Fear not of him, but of the implications, of the voices of my children, their scornful pronouncements. Too old for love. Unseemly. For a moment, their faces, their words crowded my mind. Could I do this? Did I dare? Arthur watched me, his expression open, vulnerable, patient. He wasn't rushing me. He simply laid his heart, his hope, before me. And in his eyes, I saw not a man pitying an old woman, but a man seeing a woman he loved, valued, certainly, deeply. I thought of the lonely years, the silence of my house, the feeling of being gently ushered towards the periphery of life. And then I thought of Arthur's laughter, his quiet understanding, the way he looked at me as if I were a fascinating book he couldn't wait to read more of, the way he made me feel seen, cherished, alive. The internal debate was fierce but brief. What did I have to lose? My children's approval? I was beginning to understand that their approval was conditional, predicated on my staying within the lines they'd drawn. But this was a chance for a different kind of life, a life with shared warmth, with companionship that nourished the soul. A life where I wasn't just mum or grandma, but Margaret, a woman loved. I looked at Arthur, at the sincerity etched on his face, at the hope shining in his kind eyes, and the fear receded, replaced by a resolute calm. This was my life, my choice, my chance. Yes, Arthur, I said, my voice surprisingly steady. Yes, I would consider it. I would like that very much. A slow smile spread across his face, lighting him from within. He squeezed my hand. It wasn't a grand, cinematic moment. It was quiet, real, and profoundly beautiful. A silent vow, made not against my family, but for myself, for the possibility of happiness, no matter the season of my life. Our wedding was a quiet affair, held on a bright, cold January morning at the little registry office downtown. There were no grand pronouncements, no throngs of guests, just me, Arthur, and two dear friends as witnesses, my neighbor, Elsie, who had always had a kind word and a sharper wit than most, and David, a retired colleague of Arthur's from the paramedic service, a man with a booming laugh and eyes that crinkled with genuine warmth. I wore a simple dress, a soft wool in a shade of winter blue that Arthur said matched my eyes. He wore his best suit, looking wonderfully distinguished, a small white rose in his lapel, a nod to my garden. The registrar was a kind woman with a gentle smile, and as she spoke the familiar words I never thought I'd hear directed at me again, they felt fresh, new, imbued with a quiet, profound significance. When Arthur slipped the plain gold band onto my finger, his hand steady in mine, his gaze unwavering, I felt a sense of rightness, of peace, that settled deep in my bones. This wasn't a denial of my past, of my years with John, but an affirmation of the present, of the unexpected gift, of a future I hadn't dared to imagine. There was a quiet joy in that room, a warmth that had nothing to do with the radiators hissing softly in the corner. It was the warmth of shared commitment, of a love that had found its way, despite the odds, despite the supposed rules of age and expectation. Afterwards, we went for lunch at a small, cozy restaurant Arthur knew, tucked away on a side street. We talked, we laughed. Elsie told slightly risque stories that made David bellow with delight. And I felt happy. Simply, uncomplicatedly happy. The thought of my children, of their inevitable reaction, was a shadow at the edge of my mind, but I refused to let it dim the glow of the day. I hadn't told them yet. Part of me, the part that still flinched from their disapproval, wanted to delay the inevitable. But another part, the stronger part, the part that had stood with Arthur and said, Yes. Knew that this quiet ceremony was the loudest statement I could make. It wasn't an act of defiance aimed at them, but an act of self-affirmation. This was my life, my happiness, and I would claim it. Arthur understood. He never pressed me to confront them, merely offered his quiet support. "Whenever you're ready, Margaret," he'd said, "we'll face it together." That evening, back in my house, now our house, there was a different kind of silence. Not the empty, echoing silence of loneliness, but a comfortable, companionable quiet, punctuated by the soft rustle of newspapers, the clink of teacups, the low murmur of shared thoughts. Arthur sat opposite me, reading, occasionally looking up to smile, and I knew, with a certainty that warmed me to my core, that I had made the right choice. The loudest statement wasn't always made with words. Sometimes it was made by the quiet courage to live your truth. The revelation, when it came, was not a grand confrontation, but a carefully considered unveiling, timed for what I hoped would be maximum impact with minimum immediate hysteria. I waited a week after our quiet wedding, letting the peace of our new beginning settle around us like a comforting shawl. Then I invited Sarah and Tom, along with their spouses and my older grandchildren, for Sunday tea. Not a full dinner, nothing too elaborate that might signal something amiss, just tea and scones, a familiar ritual. They arrived, their usual blend of perfunctory affection and subtle impatience. Sarah eyed the extra teacup on the tray, the slightly different arrangement of biscuits. "Expecting someone else, Mum?" she asked, a hint of suspicion already in her voice. "Yes, dear," I said calmly, pouring the tea. "My husband." The clatter of Tom's spoon as he dropped it into his saucer was immensely satisfying. Silence descended, thick and immediate. Sarah's face went pale, then flushed a dull red. "Husband," she finally choked out, her voice a tight squeak. "Mum? What on earth are you talking about?" This isn't funny. Just then, Arthur walked in from the garden, carrying a small bouquet of snowdrops he'd found blooming near the fence. He smiled, a calm, steady presence. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice even. "I'm Arthur. Arthur Finch." He placed the snowdrops in a little vase on the table. Tom stared, open-mouthed. Sarah looked from me to Arthur and back again, speechless for once in her life. My granddaughter, Emily, the one who had blurted out, "What could he possibly see in you?" actually looked intrigued, a small smile playing on her lips. "We were married last Tuesday," I announced, my voice clear and firm, betraying none of the tremors I felt inside. "A small ceremony. It was lovely." The ensuing reaction was predictable, if a little muted by shock. Sarah found her voice first, a torrent of "how could yous?" and "without telling us?" and "have you completely lost your mind, Mother?" Tom was quieter, but his disapproval radiated from him in waves. "This is highly irregular, Mother," he managed, adjusting his tie as if it were suddenly choking him. "And frankly, quite irresponsible." Irresponsible. That was a new one. I met their accusations with a calm I didn't entirely feel but projected with all my might. "Irresponsible to seek happiness?" I asked, my voice soft but unwavering. "Irresponsible to find companionship, to build a life with a good and kind man who loves me, and whom I love?" The word love seemed to stun them into another brief silence. Arthur stood beside me, his hand resting gently on my shoulder, a silent pillar of support. He didn't speak, didn't defend himself. He didn't need to. Our presence together, our quiet confidence, was its own defense. There were more sputtered protests, more veiled accusations about Arthur's motives, which I cut short. Arthur is my husband, I stated. He is part of this family now. Your acceptance would be welcome, but our happiness does not depend on it. The power dynamic in the room had shifted. I was no longer the slightly pitiable old mother they needed to manage. I was a woman who had taken control of her own life, her own happiness. They left soon after, the scones uneaten, the tea cold. Their disapproval was a palpable thing. A chill they left in their wake. But as Arthur and I cleared the table together, a new warmth filled the room. The warmth of a shared victory. A quiet revolution. Life with Arthur settled into a rhythm of quiet joys and shared moments. A gentle cadence that was the antithesis of the drama my children had predicted, or perhaps even desired. The grand passions they might have imagined, or feared, were not our way. Ours was a love built on simpler, more enduring things. The comfort of a shared breakfast table, the quiet rustle of newspapers in the evening, his hand reaching for mine as we watched the late news. He had a way of making the mundane feel special. A walk in the park became an adventure in spotting rare birds. A trip to the grocery store, an opportunity for playful debate over the best brand of biscuits. My house, once echoing with a lonely quiet, now hummed with a different kind of energy. Arthur, it turned out, was a wonderful cook, and the aroma of his stews or baking bread often filled the air, a scent of home, of contentment. He respected my routines, my need for solitary moments with my books or in my garden, just as I respected his. We were two distinct individuals choosing to walk the same path, not two halves trying to become a whole. My garden, which had always been my sanctuary, became a shared pleasure. He learned the names of my roses, helped me with the heavier digging, and even started a small herb patch of his own. We'd sit out there on mild evenings, sipping tea, watching the sunset paint the sky, and often, no words were needed. The companionship itself was enough. My children, for a while, maintained a frosty distance. Calls became perfunctory, visits sparse and strained. Sarah, in particular, seemed to view Arthur with a persistent suspicion, as if waiting for him to reveal some hidden nefarious motive. Tom mostly just looked uncomfortable, as if my happiness was an affront to his sense of order. But we didn't push. We simply lived our lives. Quietly. Contentedly. The poetic justice wasn't in their discomfort, but in our peace. Gradually, tentatively, there were thaws. Emily, my granddaughter, was the first to bridge the gap. She started visiting on her own, initially under the guise of needing help with a school project, but soon it was clear she enjoyed Arthur's gentle humor and his stories about his paramedic days. She saw him not as an interloper, but as a kind man who made her grandmother laugh, a laugh she hadn't heard so freely in years. Even Sarah, eventually, began to soften. She saw that Arthur was patient, kind, that he genuinely cared for me. She saw that I was not deluded, not being taken advantage of, but was, in fact, happier and more vibrant than I had been in a very long time. The "I told you so's" were never spoken by Arthur or me. There was no need. Our life together, the simple, undeniable evidence of our shared contentment, was its own quiet testament. We were building a loving life, brick by brick, day by day, a life that was ours, on our own terms, proving that the foundations of happiness could be laid at any age. Looking back, it's clear, isn't it? They told me I was too old for love, too old for a new chapter, too old to dream beyond the confines of their expectations. And for a time, a small part of me almost believed them. The weight of their pronouncements, born of their own fears perhaps, or their own limited view of what a life in its later seasons could hold, nearly convinced me to close a door I hadn't even realized was still ajar. But life, as it so often does, had other plans. A slip, a fall. A moment of utter vulnerability, and into my life walked Arthur. Not a knight in shining armor, but a kind man with gentle hands and eyes that saw beyond the wrinkles and the grey hairs. He saw me, and in doing so, he helped me see myself again. Our love story isn't one for breathless headlines or dramatic pronouncements. It's a quiet melody, a gentle rhythm, a testament to the enduring power of human connection. It's found in the shared silence of a comfortable room, in the warmth of a hand reached for in the night, in the easy laughter over a simple meal. My children, they've come around, mostly. They see the light in my eyes, the spring in my step that wasn't there before. They see Arthur's unwavering kindness, his steadfast devotion. Perhaps they even feel a little foolish for their earlier judgments, though they'd never admit it. And that's all right. This journey wasn't about proving them wrong. Not really. It was about proving myself right. Right to believe that happiness has no expiration date. That the heart's capacity for love doesn't diminish with the years. It simply waits, sometimes, for the right person to reawaken it. Do you ever feel that way? That the world has already written your ending, while you're still busy living the middle? They tried to write mine. A quiet, fade into grandmotherly oblivion. But I picked up the pen and wrote a different ending. Or rather, a new beginning. Arthur and I, we are not defying age. We are embracing it, together. We are showing, in our own small way, that the roots of love can take hold in any soil, at any time, if only given a little light and a little faith. The garden of life can bloom in unexpected seasons. Mine is blooming now, vibrant and full, under the gentle care of the man who not only saved my life that day, but also showed me how to truly live it again. And that, my dears, is a love story worth telling at any age.